Cumbria's MPs are adding their voices to growing calls to lift the cap on wage rises for nurses, teachers, firefighters and other public servants. At the moment, people who work in the public sector are limited to a 1% annual increase in their salaries, and now that inflation has hit nigh on 3%, it's starting to bite. But with wages having stagnated in the private sector as well, is it fair to spend more taxpayers' money on public workers' wages? We'll debate this with a range of guests shortly. First though, BBC Radio Cumbria's political reporter Bob Cooper has been taking a look at the issue.
With all the talk of extra cash for Northern Ireland and the fabled magic money tree finally being discovered, it's easy to forget that paying down the deficit was the dominant theme in politics until recently. It was that drive to get rid of the UK's overdraft that led to a pay freeze for most public sector workers between 2011 and 2013, followed by 4 years of rises limited to 1%. And with inflation now at 2.9%, people are seeing an effective cut in their wages. So how many people are affected? In Cumbria, it's estimated about 53,000 work in the public sector compared to 183,000 in the private sector, so somewhere between a fifth and a quarter. That's more than the national proportion, which is more like 1 in 6. Average earnings in the public sector are £506 a week compared to £464 a week in the private sector. But generally, jobs in the public sector tend to need higher qualifications. There has been some analysis suggesting public sector workers are still paid more even when you adjust for qualifications, although that analysis has certain limitations. The fact there are many skilled workers in the public sector has led to some concerns the pay gap will mean staff leaving public services. But if they do get higher pay rises in future, it'll mean spending more money. Someone might need to give that tree another shake.
BBC Radio Cumbria's political reporter Bob Cooper. Well, I'm joined in the studio now by Clem Coady, the head teacher at Stoneraise Primary School at Durdar near Carlisle. Rob Johnston is the chief executive of the Cumbria Chamber of Commerce. And I'm also joined on the phone by the Conservative MP for Copeland, Trudy Harrison. Trudy Harrison, good morning to you. I'll start with you first. It's your party's policy to have this 1% cap, but you, along with many of your fellow MPs, are now saying that you want to get rid of the cap. Why?
Well, I think every politician wants to see the public sector rewarded for the excellent job that they do. And whilst I said that I would like to see the 1% pay cap removed, it has to be done in accordance with the independent public sector pay body's advice, because to do this will cost somewhere in the order of £9.2 billion. The public sector represents around 25% of the workforce in Britain, but it's also important to remember that in the north alone we've got 7.2 million jobs in the private sector. So the decisions we take need to be considered with independent review bodies, because to do anything else would be simply reckless.
Your Chancellor, Philip Hammond, says that policy hasn't changed. The government needs to, and I quote, hold its nerve on this. Is he wrong?
Philip Hammond isn't wrong. What he's saying is, as I've just articulated, those decisions, without taking independent advice, would be reckless. He's quite right to say that our policy hasn't changed. We've got an independent public sector review body assessing the situation as we speak, and we'll take advice from that. The process in which public sector pay is reviewed, is happening, and by placing that cap, we've saved 200,000 jobs.
Let's have a word now with Clem Coady, who is the head teacher at Stoneraise Primary School at Durdar near Carlisle. Thanks for coming in this morning. Schools, they're facing squeezed budgets. Many actually at the moment are actually laying staff off because of rising costs. How can we therefore afford to give teachers like you an extra pay rise?
It's really interesting. What we have seen over the past several years is from the Institute of Fiscal Studies say that school pay staff has been cut 11.5% in real terms. The government's own figures produced on Monday say that teachers' pay, for example, has reduced by £3 per hour equivalent over the last few years. And as Trudy says, these figures need to be looked at in a wider context, and we need to respond to independent review bodies. And it's interesting to note that the school teachers pay review body in December last year stated that they recommended a significantly higher than a 1% pay was needed to support the profession to ensure it keeps pace with the private sector and to address the significant recruitment and retention issues schools are facing.
Well, it's funny you say the issues that schools are facing. What effect is the pay cap having on schools?
The pay cap is having real issues. What we're seeing is less teachers entering the profession than ever before, and we're seeing teachers leaving the profession at a higher rate, especially newly qualified teachers. We're seeing, for example, 25% of newly qualified teachers leaving the profession in the first 3 years of teaching, and that's one of the main reasons for that, is that the pay is not attractive enough in comparison to like-minded professionals in the private sector.
Okay, let's have a word with Rob Johnston, who is the Chief Executive of the Cumbria Chamber of Commerce. Rob, we know the private sector has also seen hard times. That doesn't mean, though, it's right to give public sector workers, and what Clem was saying there, an effective pay cut.
Well, it's an interesting one, this, Mike. Clearly, we're really interested in getting involved in this debate because our members want us to do their views. And as a result, we did a survey yesterday afternoon, and we had some pretty interesting responses. Over 200 businesses responded to this within an hour. So it shows you the sort of the view that businesses have got, or the interest on it. The response was really fascinating. The expectation, I think, is that everybody in the private sector doesn't want the public sector to have a pay rise. What came out is that in general, there was support depending on the job and depending on how it was evaluated. So the block view that the public sector should be limited by 1% is not supported. I can categorically say that with a survey. But, and there's a real but, it has to be dependent on two things. One is the pay review bodies being independent and looking at that and looking at the real challenges that those sectors have got, so nurses or teachers, in isolation. And also, it tended to be supported where businesses themselves had been quite profitable and had paid their wage rises themselves. And I put that in perspective. About 40% of employers hadn't paid a pay rise in the last 12 months at all. And they tended to be the ones who probably finding times difficult with the issues around Brexit and the state of the pound, which is actually fueling inflation, with the state of the pound actually affecting their profitability because of the cost of bought-ins. So they tend to be the ones because of their circumstance of view. But the general view tends to be, if we can afford it. The real concern, though, is if you do it in a wide way, that you sort of let the horse out of the door, as it were, and inflation runs away, and we all know what that does. So it really does. I think we're all of one voice, is the independent pay review bodies need to look at this, and that in general, private sector is not against it.
Back to Trudy Harrison. Labour put down an amendment to the Queen's speech to get rid of the pay cap. If you speak so passionately about this issue, why didn't you vote for that amendment?
I voted to see the Queen's speech get through, and that's really, really important. And it's interesting listening to Rob. As we move forward, something I was elected upon is driving investment into the north, and that's essential because it's not just the pay that's affecting our inability to attract enough highly skilled workers into the area where I represent in Copeland. We must make sure that we close the gap in terms of pay in the north, and that's about transport. It's about road and rail improvements, about digital improvements, because that will support improvement in the quality of life of our public sector and our private sector. And I hope that it will reduce the imbalance that we've had. For over 30 years, we are 25% below the average for the rest of England in the north. That's what
Clem, Coady, we have a deficit of more than £50 billion in total. Rob Johnston was saying that 40% of the private sector businesses haven't given a pay rise. If we do give public sector workers a pay rise, how do we get that extra money?
Well, what we've seen is obviously the three Conservative politicians for Cumbria voting against the 1% pay increase in Parliament last week. But what we've also seen is those same politicians voting against putting a tax on bankers' bonuses, increasing the tax rate for those people earning over £150,000 per year, and against putting extra measures in place to avoid for challenging tax avoidance.
So would you advocate raising taxes then to pay this?
I think there's got to be a wider debate and discussion in and around that. But if the government can magically find £1 billion to buy essentially 10 votes in Parliament to prop up their own position, then there must be the money there somewhere in the system. And if the public sector pay is capped at 1%, then why in 2015 was MPs allocated an 11% pay rise and a further 1.4% pay rise this April? And it's not just MPs. Judges received an 11% pay rise who were also part of the public sector pay. So if there is a true 1% pay cap, why isn't it across the board in all public sector staff?
Rob Johnston?
Why is it just the richer keep getting made rich and the rest of us paying for that?
Rob Johnston, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one of the options the government has got is to look at the commitment to reduce corporation tax and delay that, for example, which is not a major impact. It's not a good sign, we would argue, for business investment. But the reality is, what we must not do is borrow to pay this. We cannot increase the amount of debt this country's in and leave that for another generation because we can't grapple with the problems we've got at the moment. So it has to be done in a constructive way. And I guess with a mixture of very careful measures and working on peer review bodies, as mentioned earlier, that actually target specific requirements. Because the reality is we're talking about struggling to put people into Cumbria. The rest of the country is struggling. We've got effectively a jobs market which we've never seen for many, many years. So it's very difficult to attract people, and it isn't just about salary, as Trudy mentioned. The other thing I'd mention very briefly, Mike, is that this is an interesting thing because there's a perception that all public sector jobs are badly paid. That is not the case. Which is why, again, I'd push for the review bodies. And if you take Copeland, for example, the national average on private sector jobs in a population is about 17-18%. It's 53% in Copeland. The average salary in Copeland is about $14,000 a year higher than the average salary in the rest of the UK. So, it's not, what I'm saying is it's not as simple as it looks like. You've got a problem where people are poorly paid.
Okay.
And it's stopping them coming.
We have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Rob Johnston, the Chief Executive of the Cumbria Chamber of Commerce. We heard from Clem Coady, the head teacher at Stoneraise Primary School in Durdar near Carlisle, and also from the Conservative MP for Copeland, Trudy Harrison. Thank you all for joining me this morning.